When an avoidant and an empath both go no contact, something nobody talks about happens. And it is not what you think. Most people assume the empath falls apart. Most people assume the avoidant just moves on, clean, easy, unbothered. But that is not what actually happens inside either of them. What unfolds is something far more complicated, far more painful, and honestly, far more fascinating than any breakup story you have ever heard. Because when these two specific types of people cut contact with each other, they do not just lose a relationship. They lose the mirror they were using to understand themselves. And that changes everything. Stay with me, because in the next few minutes, I am going to walk you through exactly what happens to both of them, day by day, week by week, and why most of them end up making the same fatal mistake that pulls them right back into the cycle. If you have ever been in one of these relationships, or if you are in one right now, this is going to feel uncomfortably accurate. Before we go further, drop the word mirror in the comments right now. Just that one word. It tells me you are actually here, you are paying attention, and it helps this reach the people who genuinely need it. And if this kind of deep emotional intelligence content is what you are hungry for, subscribe to Empathix, because this is what we do here. So let us start at the very beginning. Let us start at the moment no contact begins, not the moment someone decides to go no contact, not the planning, not the journaling, not the conversations with friends about whether it is the right move. The actual moment. The moment the last message is sent, the last door closes, the last phone call ends, that specific second when the silence begins. For the empath, that moment feels like jumping off a cliff in slow motion. For the avoidant, that moment feels like finally being able to breathe. And right there in those two completely opposite internal experiences is the seed of everything that comes next. Now, to understand this properly, you need to understand what these two people have been doing to each other, often without realizing it. For the entire duration of the relationship, the empath is someone who feels everything deeply, not in a poetic, romanticized way, in a very real, very exhausting, very consuming way. They pick up on emotional frequencies the way a radio picks up signals, other people's moods, other people's pain, other people's unspoken needs. They absorb all of it. And in a relationship, this means they become extraordinarily attuned to their partner. They notice the micro expressions. They notice the slight change in tone. They notice when something is off before their partner has even consciously registered that something is off. With an avoidant partner, this becomes both their gift and their curse. The avoidant is someone whose entire nervous system was trained, usually in childhood, to associate emotional closeness with danger, not necessarily dramatic danger. Sometimes it was just a parent who was emotionally unavailable. Sometimes it was an environment where expressing feelings led to shame or rejection, or simply nothing. No response, no acknowledgement, just silence. And so the child learned, feelings are not safe. Closeness is not safe. Independence is the only reliable thing. That child grows into an adult who genuinely craves connection, but is terrified of it at the same level. And when an empath and an avoidant come together, something electric and devastating happens simultaneously. The empath feels like they have finally found someone worth saving, someone with so much hidden depth, someone who clearly has so much pain underneath the surface. And if they could just reach them, if they could just love them enough, something beautiful would crack open. The avoidant feels, often for the first time in a very long time, genuinely seen. The empath's attunement feels incredible to them. Someone actually gets them without them having to explain, without them having to be vulnerable, without them having to do the terrifying work of opening up The empath does it for them, reads them, understands them, accepts them. And so they are drawn together like two planets whose gravitational pulls were made for each other's destruction. The relationship has a pattern. The empath pursues. The avoidant retreats. The empath pursues harder. The avoidant retreats further. The empath interprets this retreat as a sign that they have not loved enough, not been enough, not done enough. So they give more. They accommodate more. They shrink more. And the avoidant, feeling the increasing pressure of all that closeness, pulls back more. This cycle goes on and on. Sometimes for months, sometimes for years, sometimes for decades, until one day someone hits a wall. Sometimes it is the empath who finally exhausts themselves completely. Sometimes it is the avoidant who reaches a threshold of overwhelm. Sometimes both happen at almost the same moment, which is when no contact begins. And this is where things get genuinely interesting, because no contact is not just the absence of communication. It is an entirely different kind of conversation, one that happens entirely inside each person's own mind, and the two internal conversations happening simultaneously on opposite sides of this silence are almost impossible to reconcile. Let us follow the empath first. Day one of no contact for the empath is not peace. It is not relief. It is not the triumphant exhale of someone who finally made a good decision for themselves. Day one is a kind of free fall. The empath's entire system is wired to scan for connection. Their nervous system has been spending months or years tracking every mood shift of their avoidant partner, every text, every silence, every small gesture, every withdrawal. That tracking took up an enormous amount of internal bandwidth. And suddenly there is nothing to track. The signal is gone. And the tracking system does not just switch off. It goes haywire. They check their phone constantly, not because they are weak, because their nervous system is doing exactly what it was trained to do in this relationship. It is looking for the signal that would tell them everything is okay. They replay conversations, not to torture themselves on purpose, but because their mind is trying to find the moment it went wrong, the exact sentence, the precise turning point, so they can understand it, fix it, prevent it from happening again. They feel guilt, even if the relationship was painful, even if they were the one who initiated no contact, because empaths tend to absorb responsibility for other people's pain, and the thought of their avoidant partner sitting in silence, possibly hurting, possibly needing them, is almost physically unbearable. And underneath all of this, underneath the phone checking and the replaying and the guilt, is something even deeper. Something that the empath often cannot even articulate clearly in week one. A profound identity question. If I am not taking care of this person, who am I? Because many empaths, particularly those who grew up in environments where their emotional needs were secondary to everyone else's, have built their entire sense of self around being needed, around being the one who understands, around being the emotional anchor in other people's storms, roam the storm, and they do not know where to stand. This is not weakness. This is a deeply human response to a deeply human wound. Now let us go to the avoidant on day one, for the avoidant often feels like relief, and they will feel guilty about that relief, which they will then push down quickly, because feeling guilty means sitting with a feeling, and sitting with feelings is not something their system is comfortable with, but the relief is real. The pressure is gone. The constant undercurrent of someone needing more from them than they knew how to give, the guilt of not being able to meet the empath's emotional needs, the claustrophobia of someone who saw them so clearly, who wanted so much access to the interior of them. All of that lifts, And for the first few days, maybe even the first week or two, the avoidant genuinely feels fine. They keep busy. This is important. The avoidance primary coping strategy is activity, distraction, forward movement. They will work more. They will exercise more. They will call old friends. They will start a new project. They will fill every hour of every day with something that does not require them to feel anything. And it works for a while. But somewhere around the 2 to 3 week mark, something begins to happen that the avoidant is not prepared for. The silence starts to have a texture. It is not the comfortable silence of someone who has chosen solitude. It is a silence that feels hollow in a way that is difficult to explain. There are moments, usually small and unexpected, where something happens and the avoidant's first impulse is to share it with the empath. They see something funny, they hear a song, they have a hard day, and for just a split second before they remember, they reach toward where that person used to be, and they are not there. And the avoidant does what the avoidant always does with feelings that are too big. They minimize, they rationalize, they tell themselves they are better off. They remind themselves of all the reasons the relationship was not working, all the reasons the empath was too much, too needy, too intense, too emotionally demanding. But the minimizing requires energy, and that energy starts to cost them more than they expected. Now, here is the thing that most people miss when they talk about avoidance in no contact. The avoidance suppression of emotion does not mean the emotion is not there. It means the emotion has been pushed underground, and underground emotions do not stay underground forever. They seep up through the cracks in ways that are often not immediately recognizable as grief. The avoidant might find themselves irritable without knowing why, short-tempered at work, restless at night. They might notice they are drinking a little more, working a little too hard, filling silence with noise in a way that feels slightly desperate, even to them. And if they are self-aware enough to get quiet for even a moment, which most avoidants are deeply skilled at avoiding, they would find something beneath all that productivity and all that forward momentum. They miss the empath, not in a dramatic, overwhelming way at first, in a quiet, nagging way, in the way you miss something that you did not realize was essential until it was gone. But the avoidant does not call it missing. They do not even let themselves think the word. They call it adjustment. They call it just needing some time. They call it getting their life back together, and they keep moving. Meanwhile, the empath is somewhere between week 2 and week 3, and something is starting to shift for them too. The initial chaos of no contact begins to settle into something else. Not peace yet, but a kind of exhausted stillness. And in that stillness, something quietly extraordinary begins to happen. The empath starts to hear themselves. Because when you spend months or years with your entire internal attention focused on tracking another person's emotional state, your own inner voice gets very quiet. You stop hearing your own needs. You stop recognizing your own feelings as separate from the feelings you are absorbing from your partner. You become a tuning fork that vibrates at someone else's frequency, and you forget entirely what your own natural frequency sounds like. But when the signal stops, when the avoidant is no longer there to be tracked, a kind of internal quiet descends. And in that quiet, the empath begins to hear, for the first time in a very long time, the sound of their own thoughts. And what they find there is sometimes deeply uncomfortable, because many empaths, when they get honest with themselves in this quiet, realize that what they were calling love had a significant component of something else, something that takes courage to name, a compulsion, a need to be needed, a terror of their own emptiness that was being filled by the project of loving someone who was hard to reach, they start to ask uncomfortable questions, not about the avoidant, about themselves. Why did I stay when I was consistently unhappy? Why did I interpret their withdrawal as a challenge to love harder rather than a sign that something was fundamentally mismatched? Why did my sense of self-worth become so entangled in whether or not I could reach them? These are not easy questions, but they are the right ones. And the fact that the empath is asking them in week 3 is actually a sign of something very healthy beginning to grow. Now, while the empath is doing this internal archaeology, the avoidant is beginning to hit a very different kind of wall. Around the 4 to 6 week mark, something happens in the avoidant's inner world that their defenses have a harder and harder time containing. They start to idealize. Human memory is not a recording. It is a reconstruction. And when we are in pain, even suppressed pain, we reconstruct the past through a filter that emphasizes what was good and minimizes what was difficult. This is not a character flaw. It is how human memory operates under emotional stress. And so the avoidant begins to remember the empath, not as they actually were, not as the person who felt like too much, not as the relationship that felt suffocating. They begin to remember the empath as they felt in the very beginning. In the early days when everything was still new enough to feel safe, when the empath's attunement felt like magic rather than pressure, when being seen felt like a gift rather than an exposure, they remember a version of the empath that is at least partially a construction, a highlight reel, and they start to miss that person with an intensity that surprises them. This is where the avoidant becomes dangerous to the no contact process, because the avoidance idealization combined with their current discomfort, combined with the fact that reaching out feels far less vulnerable than sitting with their feelings, creates a very strong impulse to make contact. And here is the cruel irony of avoidant psychology. The same person who consistently withdrew during the relationship, the same person who consistently communicated through distance that closeness was too much for them, is now on the verge of reaching out. Not because they have done any inner work, not because something has fundamentally changed, but because the discomfort of absence has temporarily become greater than the fear of closeness, and they often do reach out. A text, a seemingly casual message, something that sounds low stakes on the surface. Hey, just wanted to check in, or I saw something that reminded me of you, or simply, how are you? And when that message arrives in the empath's phone, after weeks of silence, something seismic happens. Every carefully built day of the empath's healing process suddenly becomes unstable, because the message feels like everything the empath was waiting for without admitting they were waiting for it. It feels like proof that they were right to believe in this person. It feels like the breakthrough they spent months trying to create through love and patience and sacrifice. It feels like the avoidant has finally chosen them. But this is the moment of greatest danger in the entire no contact process for both of them, because the avoidant has not changed. Not yet. They have just gotten uncomfortable enough to reach toward the thing that felt good. The moment contact is reestablished and some of that discomfort is relieved, the old dynamics will reassert themselves with a speed and completeness that feels almost mechanical. The empath will feel hope and start to give. The avoidant will feel the return of closeness pressure and start to pull back. The cycle will begin again, unless. And this is a very specific unless at least one of them has used the no contact period to do something genuinely different on the inside. Let us talk about what genuinely different looks like for each of them. For the empath, Genuine inner work during no contact means beginning to locate the wound that made avoidant love feel so compelling in the first place, because this is the hard truth that the empath needs to hear. The reason avoidant love felt so intoxicating was not random. The push and pull, the moments of warmth followed by withdrawal, the love that had to be earned again and again. That pattern was familiar on a cellular level. For many empaths, it mirrors the first love they ever experienced, the love of a parent or caregiver who was emotionally inconsistent, who was sometimes present and sometimes not, whose approval felt conditional, whose love had to be pursued. And so when the avoidant pursues and withdraws, some deep part of the empath recognizes the pattern and believes on a level below conscious thought that if they can finally win this person's consistent love, they will heal something that has been broken in them for a very long time. But that healing cannot come from outside. That is the terrible and liberating truth. The empath has to learn often for the very first time what it feels like to tend to their own emotional needs, to notice what they are feeling without immediately outsourcing that feeling to someone else's response, to recognize their own worth without measuring it through the lens of someone else's desire for them. This is enormous work. It is quiet work. It is unglamorous, but it is the only work that actually changes anything. And for the avoidant, genuine inner work during no contact means doing something they have spent an entire lifetime masterfully avoiding. It means sitting with discomfort long enough to feel what is underneath it. It means getting honest about what the withdrawal actually protected them from, not just in this relationship, but in all of them, in childhood, in every situation where they made themselves smaller or colder or more self-sufficient because full emotional presence felt too dangerous. It means asking the question that avoidants almost never let themselves ask. What would happen if I actually let someone in? What is the specific fear underneath all this distance? Is it abandonment? Is it engulfment? Is it the terrifying possibility of needing someone who might not stay? These questions are uncomfortable. For someone whose entire coping architecture is built on not feeling things, they are almost unbearable. But without them, the avoidant will keep repeating the same pattern in every relationship